All right, welcome to part 2 demo for chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with views. And you'll recall views is just what we call everything really that we see showing up in the project browser. So in part 1 we talked about how to duplicate views. Remember, there are multiple ways we can duplicate a view, and they each have a particular purpose. So standard duplicate is going to duplicate all of the view settings. It's going to duplicate really everything except for the detail objects. Remember, the detail objects are things that we put into a view that are only going to show up in that view. That would include things like annotations, detail lines, really everything that we're going to find on the Annotate tab. All of these things really are only going to show up in the view that you create them in. So when we duplicate a view, when we're just using the standard duplicate, it's going to duplicate just the basic model components. That's all you're going to see in that duplicate. Duplicate with detailing is going to copy over all of those detail items, those things that we created in the view that would be found on the Annotate tab. Those will come over as a one-off copy. However, if you edit those detail items, annotations, dimensions, detail lines, things like that, in the second view that you created, it does not change the first view that you started with, the original, and vice versa. Duplicate as a dependent, however, is an exact copy and updates both the parent view and the copied view regardless of the type of object you're changing. Today we're going to be talking about creating callout views. Callout views are those areas on the plan where you see another view referenced in an existing view. So like a floor plan, you might call out an enlarged floor plan view. In a section view, you might see an enlarged section view called out. So we're going to talk about how to create those, and then we're also going to talk about how to create interior and exterior elevations and section views. These are all things that we've touched on or just sort of breezed past in previous discussions, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail today and talk about how to create them and how to edit those. So kind of a lot to cover in this video, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with callout views, and for this we're going to go to floor 1, floor plan, and we're just going to kind of look at an area like this and think about why we might create an enlarged detail view on a floor plan. The main reason, of course, is when you get into an area like a kitchen or a restroom, there's a lot of stuff going on in there, and on the overall floor plan sometimes it's hard to see all of the required detail in that plan view. So we create an enlarged view of just that area on another sheet probably, or maybe on the same sheet, but we're going to create a larger scale view of that area so that we can sort of blow it up and add the necessary detail like dimensions, notes, and other things. So anytime we're going to create a new view, we're going to expect that view to show up in the project browser someplace, and you can see this is set up to display by category. And right now we don't have any existing views for a few of the categories that are available. One of them is section views. We don't see a section views category yet, but as soon as we create a view of that type, we're going to see that category show up. But all of the views that we're going to create are going to be found on the View tab, and you can see a number of different view types listed here in the middle of the ribbon. The one we're interested right now is the callout view. You can see we can create this thing in a couple different ways. The easiest, of course, is the rectangle, and let's go ahead and do that first. And we're going to just draw a rectangle by creating or selecting 2 points. And we're going to pick one point sort of in the upper left corner, and then we're just going to move our cursor. We're not clicking and dragging, we're just clicking and letting go and then moving our cursor. And then we sort of define the other corner of that boundary down here, and as soon as we click, that view is created. Now the callout itself can be edited, what that thing looks like, and usually when we create a callout, we're going to get something like this, where the actual callout bubble is overlapping with some existing building geometry. We don't really want to leave it that way, so usually what we're going to do is try to find a corner someplace. We grab this grip and we find a corner someplace off in an area that's easy to read, and I'm just going to go ahead and put that right here. And then the other thing we usually do, and this is just sort of a stylistic thing, but we're going to grab this middle grip. We're going to sort of drag this thing down to where we can kind of get it horizontal like so. But you'll notice it doesn't snap into a horizontal position right away. So if you click and hold that grip and just kind of drag it around like this and then just let it go, and then click it again, and you'll notice now it will snap into a horizontal position. Why Revit does that, why you have to do that sort of double grab thing on this grip, I don't know, but it is what it is. But this is usually the style that we see with these enlarged view callouts. The tail of this thing sort of comes off horizontally, and then it just sort of comes up into an angle into one of the corners. It's not always done that way, but most of the time that's what we see. So it's just a good idea to play around with that a little bit. Just take a minute and practice that for a minute. Just make sure that you have just a little bit of an understanding of how those grips work on those callouts. So this is not a new view type. This is still a floor plan view, so you will find this under the floor plan category, and you'll see right here, floor 1 callout 1 is what we just created. So let's go ahead and double click on that view to open it up. And here's our enlarged view, and now we can change this scale to be whatever we want. We can have it at 1/4 inch, or if we wanted to or needed to, we could increase that even further to 1/2 inch. And that scale is going to basically be displayed as soon as we drag this view onto a sheet. So the larger the scale, the larger the overall view is going to be physically on the sheet. So just make sure that you understand what that's doing when you change the scale. Sometimes it's a good idea to, before you even go very much farther on your detailing, to actually drag that onto a sheet and just make sure it's going to fit in the space that you have allotted for it. We could now add some annotations. So if we go to the Annotate tab and we just put a single dimension in here, I'm just going to run a dimension from the center line of this wall over to the center line of this wall and place it. And you'll notice that dimension looks really, really small. It is the correct size. You can see 3/32 Arial. That is our standard text height that we want to see printed in most of the things that we do in architectural design. So the text height is correct. It's just that the scale is so large, the dimension itself relatively looks small. But you'll also notice if you go back to floor 1, those dimensions are not going to show up on the main floor view. So any annotations you create in a view should not perpetuate over to another view. Those are just going to be visible in that view. So most of the things we're going to be talking about today are that way. So if we change something in one view, unless it's a dependent view of a parent view, it will not affect any other view. That's a key thing to remember in Revit. Let's go ahead and try the same thing in a wall section. We don't have a wall section yet, as I mentioned previously, so we're going to start off by creating that. And again, this is a new view, so we're going to go to the View tab, and we're going to go to the Section tool. Now with sections, you don't have 2 different buttons for the 2 different section types, but we do have 2 different section types. So it's always important to kind of, before you start clicking after you've started a tool, look at the options that you have. We do have a couple, just one actually, option in the options bar itself, but we also have the type selector that showed up. And you can see right now we have the building section type selected. We're going to create a wall section. So what we're going to do is go down here and select wall section instead. And now we're just going to cut through this wall right here. We're going to place our first point here. And again, this is not a click and drag. This is just a click and then click again. So we place that section view there. Now this is backwards actually. What we really want to do is have this view title on the outside, or this view bubble on the outside. So we can cycle through both of these things. We have one there, and then we have one up here that we can cycle through. And if we wanted to, for example, switch the direction we're looking, we could also select this and flip to the other side. This view sort of range right here, this little blue dotted line when it's selected, is talking about our view depth. So this is how far we can see with that view. And we usually, with the wall section, we don't want to see a lot of stuff in the background like this wall or this door. So we typically are going to try to drag that thing back and hold and limit the view of what we see. We just want to focus on the wall itself. All right, let's go ahead and go to this view now. We're going to double click on the view bubble. And here's our wall section. You can see it goes all the way from the foundation up to the parapet here. And right away we notice that it's lacking in some detail. We just see this in 2 lines, and that's usually our cue to increase the detail level, which we normally want to see maximum detail in a section view. So we just change the view setting to the detail level to fine. And then of course we probably want to set the scale to something else like 1/2 inch perhaps. So notice that when the scale changes, any annotations like these level indicators, they all are going to shrink relative to the overall size of the view. Now, again, I'll just caution you that anytime you have a view that is relatively large, you are limited on the scale that you can use, and that limit is the size of the sheet that you've chosen. So if you are working on any project, it's always a good idea to decide on the sheet size very early in the project, because every sheet needs to be the same size. Remember, any architectural plan is intended to be stapled together in a book, and all the pages of a book must be the same size. So we're going to depart a little bit from our discussion on views, and we're going to create a new sheet. We're going to right click on the sheets category, say new sheet, and we're going to go ahead and use the largest architectural size that's typically used in industry, E1, which is 30 by 42, and say OK. Now that we have that sheet, let's go ahead and drag our section view that we just created, section 1, out onto the sheet, and let's see how big it is. So clearly a 1/2 inch scale for a building this size is not going to be possible, not without some sort of modification to the view. We could cut chunks of it out, but in most cases what we're going to do is have to change the scale of it. So we can do that right here on the sheet. If we go into the properties with it selected, we can go into the properties and change that view scale to something else. So I've changed it to 1/8 of an inch. And that gets it pretty small, but at least it fits on the sheet. We could try one more scale up from that, 3/16, see if that fits, and it looks like it does. So that looks like an appropriate scale we could use for that view. Now when I changed that scale, even when we're in the sheet, since I changed the properties of that view, when we go back to that section view, you're going to find that that scale has changed there as well. So everything in Revit is sort of interconnected. Another key thing to remember about Revit. In a situation like this, we may want to do an enlarged detail where the roof ties into the wall, the exterior support wall. So what we're going to do is we're going to create that call out view here. Let's go ahead and just use the same one, the rectangle. And we're just going to include all of this stuff in that rectangle. Once we have that view created, now we can change where this call out is located. I'm just going to kind of put it right here, and then remember that 2-part trick where we can level this thing out. Drag it once and then drag it again, and it'll snap to a horizontal position. If you've been wondering why we don't have numbers populated in this view bubble, just remember that those don't happen until this view that we just created gets dragged on to a sheet. As soon as it's dragged onto a sheet, it'll give it a detail number, and it'll align the sheet number with the sheet that we put it on. So fairly straightforward, not too tough. These call out views, again, can be created in really any view. You can create them in a section view, a floor plan view, even an elevation view, if you needed to call something out in a projected view like an elevation. So speaking of elevations, let's go ahead and take a look at those next. We're going to go back to floor 1 for a minute. And elevations, just like sections, there are a few different types we can create. You can see the two main ones listed here in the drop down. There's just standard elevation and there's framing elevation. Typically we're not going to use the framing elevation in a lot of the things that we're doing. That would be more of a structural design type of a operation. So we're just going to use the standard elevation, and then under that you can see that there are a couple of different types. So we have a building elevation, which would typically be interpreted as being an exterior elevation. Those elevations that you see right here and here and here and here all the way around, you have those 4 elevation views existing. But we also have interior elevation views, and those just look a little bit different than the exterior ones. They do basically the same thing, but the interior elevation views, which is what we're going to create, are going to have multiple view options in a single symbol. So I've selected that interior elevation view. Now I just need to place it someplace. Typically when we see an interior elevation view, we're going to do it someplace like in a kitchen or a bathroom where there's cabinetry or casework, different things that we need to detail. And you'll also notice that as I move this thing around, the direction that the arrow is pointing is adjusting to the nearest wall. Doesn't matter where you place it. If you're going to create more than one view, we're going to go ahead and just place it right here for now. Click, and you can see that single elevation is created, elevation 1A. Now when you select the elevation marker or symbol, you'll notice that you can add additional elevation views just by clicking the little box. Okay, so now I have 3 elevation views, and I'm just going to move this. Whoops, that is not what I wanted to move. Control Z. I'm going to move this room label kind of down out of the way a little bit so I can center this thing a little better. And I'm going to drag this down. One of the things that you'll notice with most of these kind of call outs, like a section or an elevation view, is you have to have it deselected before you can move it. If it's selected and you try to grab it, sometimes it does funny things. Same thing with, like, if I wanted to open up this elevation 1B, I can double click on the arrow just like I can double click on this arrow, but it has to be deselected when I do that. So always just kind of get in the habit of clicking someplace away from it to deselect it, or clicking on the modify tool up in the upper left. And I'm going to drag this thing down just a little bit, center it in the space. And then I can just go ahead and open up one of these views. I'll open up this one. There's not going to be much to look at, unfortunately, because I don't have anything detailed in there. And you'll notice also that it gave me an elevation view of all these different levels. Well, I was only interested in the level 1, so I'm just going to drag this down and shorten it up a little bit and kind of drag this in a little bit just so it's including only the portions of the building that I want. So that's another key thing in Revit, is the views don't always come in exactly the size or the view depth that you want, so you will have to make some adjustments, and then you'll also need to adjust the detail level and possibly the scale. So if we had already designed the kitchen and placed all the cabinets and the appliances and things like that, they would all be showing up in this view, but we didn't do any of that yet, so kind of boring to look at this point, but that certainly would populate with anything that we added to that floor plan as we did it. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the exterior elevations then. You'll notice that these elevation markers, they're just sort of randomly placed, and that's because when you start a new project, they're already in there. They oftentimes are going to add those elevation markers just automatically when you create the view. So they're not always in a good spot, and quite often we're going to leave those in place, right? Especially if we have some exterior elevation views that we're calling out, and we want to have those referenced when we place those elevations on a sheet. So on the floor plan, we're going to see those referenced either in the site plan view or even on a floor plan view like this. But we typically are going to want to make sure that those show up on the sheet, so we'll drag them in closer if they're really far away, and we'll drag them away a little bit if they're too close, getting in the way of the dimensions and stuff we want to add later. But for now, that's good. Let's go ahead and just experiment with what these things do. I'm going to first single click on the view triangle. We'll just call it the triangle itself here. When you select that, you'll notice this little line shows up here, and this is basically where our eyes are located. So this is setting where you could sort of think of it as the camera for the view. That's where you're standing. And this can be adjusted. You could just simply drag this thing forward or back, and within this range right here, it's not going to change what my view looks like. But if there were things out in the yard here or out in the parking lot that we did not want to see in the view, we could just simply drag this thing closer, and as long as it's down here, as long as it's behind this line, we're not going to see it. Similarly, if it's too far forward, we're actually going to be cutting into that building. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. If I drag it right here, I'm outside the building, and I open that view, you can see that I can see the entire exterior of that building as intended. But if and again, I'm selecting the triangle part, if I drag that thing into the building a little bit, look what that does to the view, how it changes it. You can see I'm now cutting through that portion of the building. So we just need to understand what that line is and how it works so that we can make sure that it's placed correctly. Moving this entire thing, moving this entire thing down, you'll notice, does not change the position of that line. So that is a separate thing that you just need to be aware of. The marker itself does not define what the view looks like. It's just sort of out there as a symbol for the view. The other thing we can do with that marker, you can see there's two parts to it. The top one is the view. The bottom one is actually the marker itself. So we can add more markers. We could just by adding these check marks, similar to the interior view, but this would be, normally we would only use this in the case where like we did an exterior elevation in a courtyard, so it's technically an exterior elevation, but it's sort of like in an interior space, so we might have more than one view. Or if we have multiple buildings, there's one down here as well that we wanted to pick up. We just add a view by putting a check in the box. So let's open up this elevation view one more time. We can see the exterior of the building, and if we zoom in, you can see this is the detail level that we're displaying currently. We've already talked a little bit about scale. We've talked a little bit about detail level. The one right next to that, though, we haven't yet talked about, and that's visual style. And visual style can be changed just for this view. Again, these are all view specific settings, but if we change the visual style, we can just have it display a little bit differently. For example, wireframe gives us X-ray vision. We can see right through the buildings. Oftentimes that's really difficult to look at and confusing. Hidden line is what the default is, and that's what most of our elevation views and section and floor plan views are going to be set to. In some cases, we might want to add a little bit of color, so we could change it to a shaded view. We could also change it to a consistent color view, which basically takes the shadows away from that other view. And then we can get further into some display settings by going to textured view, and that one oftentimes is going to test the quality of your video card a little bit. It's going to slow things down. So we typically aren't going to operate or try to do any kind of drafting work in this setting. And then the most demanding one on your video card, and the one that'll slow it down the most, is realistic. You can see my wheel is just sitting there spinning. It's thinking about what this thing should look like. It'll add the maximum amount of resolution to our view, but it also is going to really slow things down. So it's usually best to just kind of leave things in hidden line view. Typically we're going to print that way because we always are going to reproduce prints in black and white anyway. And we're going to leave those color settings to a rendering, which we'll talk about another time. Okay, this next thing I want to talk about is, it doesn't really fall into any neat categories, so we're just going to kind of jump to a 3D view and talk about this thing. I'm talking about a section box. And a lot of these tools that we're using, elevations and sections and things, we do need these on our final set of plans. Oftentimes we're going to create these views for the purpose of printing them and including them in the construction documents. But sometimes we use them just for drafting. So one of the tools that we use for drafting is this section box. And the section box is sort of this unimposing little setting over here in the properties palette, about halfway down, that you can either check or uncheck. And all this does is allows you to sort of strip away or crop the view that you're looking at. And typically it's going to be useful in a 3D, just a standard 3D view. But you'll notice that this cube shows up when we turn on section box, and it's got multiple grips, one grip on each side of the box. So there's a total of six grips, and you sometimes have to position yourself a little bit differently to see all of the grips that you need. So if I wanted to, for example, pare this thing down to maybe the first level, I can just drag this grip down, and it basically just strips away everything else. But this is a kind of a quick, easy way to kind of take a look inside your building and make sure everything is where it's supposed to be. When you're done with section box, all you have to do is just turn it back off. So it's just a toggle in there, and that will return the display to the full building. Now, we're going to be going through a number of additional view settings here in the remainder of this video. I would just caution that because we're covering a lot of material, it probably is a good idea to just pause and try these things out. You won't perhaps remember everything here, but if you know that it's available, if you know that you remember that it was a tool that we covered and we talked about how to do it, usually you can dig through and find where that thing is just by banging around in the ribbons or even going to Google and just reminding yourself how to do something. But take notes also, take the time to practice. We are covering a lot of fundamentals in the first part of this class. These things are going to come back up, and some of them will get repeated, but others may not quite as often. So just try to commit as much as you can of this to memory. All right. One of the things we talk about a lot this is not something it's not going to be a one and done type of thing, is this tool called Visibility Graphic Overrides. So Visibility Graphic Overrides are also going to be found in the Properties palette. I'm going to just drag this open a little bit. It's this one right here. Visibility Graphic Overrides are available to change the view settings by view, just like these other things we've done down here. But we have a standard for what things look like, and that standard is sort of set in the template, and we can change that standard, but we might not want to change it for every view. So when we use Visibility Graphic Overrides, we're doing it because we want this view to look different than all the other views. For example, we might want all of the walls to look like hidden lines in this view, but we only want it to look that way on floor 1, not on floor 2 through 8. So we would use a Visibility Graphic Override just on this view to change what walls look like. Let's go ahead and click into Visibility Graphic Overrides. We're just going to click on this edit tool right here, and you can see that all of the different object categories are listed over here in the left hand side. And you can see as you scroll down through there are a lot of different categories. Now most of these categories you'll notice have a check mark next to them, which just means that they are visible in this view. But if we wanted to change that visibility, if we were looking at something and we wanted to hide all of that type of thing in this view, we could just simply uncheck it, right? So if we had a bunch of things cluttering up our view, like furniture, for example, and we didn't want to see furniture on this view, we could simply uncheck furniture. Now I don't have any furniture in here, but if I did, if I went to Visibility Graphic Overrides, unchecked furniture right here, right? Then furniture would not show up in that view, okay? But the visibility isn't the only thing we can control with Visibility Graphic Overrides. We can also control what the things that are visible look like. So let's take just a minute to explain and examine what all of these things are here in the main part of this window. First, this is broken down into two main categories. Objects that we are seeing in projection, or the surface of them, and objects that we are seeing in a cut view. Okay? So remember that whenever we create a view, we're always, not always, but oftentimes we're cutting through some things and we're seeing other things beyond that cut line. So for example, in a floor plan view, we're cutting through the walls, assuming that the walls go up high enough to pass through our cut plane. In a plan view, the cut plane is typically 4 feet above the floor. And we're going to just look real quick at view range here to examine how that's defined. So right here in this floor plan view, this particular one, the cut plane is set to 4 feet above the associated level, which is floor 1. So we've cut through this wall all the way around, and so this wall is going to be shown in this view as a cut style or cut type of view object. So anything we do to affect the walls needs to happen in one of these two categories here. If, for example, we were looking at something on the floor, like furniture, maybe furniture that is less than 4 feet tall, we would be seeing that in projection. So anything that we would want to do to change how it looks needs to be done in one of these three categories. So to demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is turn off thin lines. You may remember we've talked about thin lines in the past. We usually leave that turned on just so we can see the necessary detail, but I'm going to go ahead and turn that off so that I see the actual line weight of how those lines are going to look. And I want to change what walls look like, as we talked about a minute ago. So I'm going to go back into Visibility Graphic Override. Sometimes I just call that VGO for short. And we're going to find the walls category. So we go down here and there's walls. You'll notice that walls in most of these objects have subcategories underneath them. So you can see that there are multiple subcategories. We're not going to worry about those right now. We're going to just leave that collapsed. And we're going to go across here and we're going to have to figure out which column we need to override to change what the wall looks like? Well, as discussed a minute ago, we're cutting through the walls because the walls go all the way up through the view, through the cut plane, that 4-foot high cut plane. So what we want to do is change what these lines of the walls look like. We don't really have any patterns. Those walls are not hatched in any way, so the patterns aren't going to really change anything. There's nothing displayed with patterns anyway. So we're going to change the line category. So we come down this column until it intersects with the walls row, and we're going to just click on that cell. Now you'll notice that some cells are white, some cells are gray. The white ones are the only ones that you can actually override. So we're going to go ahead and click it once to display the override, and then we'll click it again to actually override. And we have 3 different things that we can override: the pattern, the color, and the weight. Now it seems a little bit counterintuitive that we can affect the pattern when we just said that we're not actually looking at the pattern. But in this case, what we're actually talking about here is the line type. So with the pattern, the line type, we're going to change it from solid to this first one here, just to kind of keep it simple. Now we could also change the color if we wanted to, and we can also change the thickness of that line. But we're just going to change the line type for now. We're going to say OK. You can see that override now shows up in the cell, and that's your cue when you come in here that this has been overridden in this view. We're going to say OK, and then all of the walls that we're cutting through are showing up now as a hidden line. Interestingly, you'll notice that this wall right here is not showing up as a hidden line, and that's because this particular wall, if you come over here and look at the height of it, it is only 4 feet tall. So this is a half wall, and it's not actually passing through our cut plane. It's coming up to and stopping at our cut plane, but that's enough to make it not respond to the change that we applied to the cut pattern. Okay, so I think that's probably enough on visibility graphic overrides, but there's a lot more to that, and we will get into a little bit more detail on that later on in the semester and in the semesters that follow. But even with that basic amount of information, you can imagine all the different things that you can do to affect the view, keeping in mind that that is not going to affect any other view and how it looks. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is underlay. Underlay is a temporary view setting that we can use to display one floor on top of our current floor, or another floor over the top of our current floor. So you can kind of think of it as if you have 2 sheets of paper that are semi-transparent, you could just sort of stack those and you can see both floors at the same time. Now one of them is going to be a little bit dimmer than the other one, but we'll be able to see it. So for example, if we go to floor 3 that doesn't really have any kind of floor plan established, and we compare that to floor 2, which does have a floor plan established, we could sort of use that floor 2 to temporarily display, or we could go to floor 3 and temporarily display floor 2 over the top of it, actually sort of laid under it, if you think about the name. And where that happens is on underlay. So I'm on floor 3 right now, which is basically blank, but I want to display floor 2 as an underlay. So I come down here to the underlay category, and keep in mind you may have to expand this if it's not already. But the underlay is defined simply by clicking on this little drop down right here. And I can define any floor that I want. So I said that I wanted to display floor 2 here, so I'm going to go ahead and just click on that. And then you'll notice that the display, as I mentioned, is sort of grayed out. So that's your cue. Whenever you see that, that's your cue that you have an underlay going on. And unfortunately, Revit, in some of its templates, by default, has an underlay displayed on a floor. So if you're working on a project, especially next semester when we're doing our final projects in 237, and you come across this where your floor is just cluttered up with walls that you didn't create, that's just because an underlay is on and it's displaying walls that are on another floor. So all you have to do is just switch this back to none to get that to go away. Okay, so underlay, we can talk about some different reasons we might want to use underlay. I think you can use your imagination on that. But basically, when we are setting up things like stairwells or vertical alignment. Sometimes we want to temporarily see another floor so that we can align the thing on this floor with it. And we can actually use those objects. We can actually trace those objects when we're creating things like walls and columns and things like that. So it's a really handy tool to have, but just don't get yourself confused by it and leave it on. It's always a good idea to just have those things shut off when you're not drafting using those objects as a guide. All right, we touched on this a minute ago, the view range. We can just click on this edit, and this is going to show us where all of the different view levels are vertically. Okay, so that's the best way to kind of think about view range. This is something that we see in plan views only. So the view range is going to be defined as the top, the cut plane, and the bottom. Anytime we're looking at a plan view, we have to define what we can see by this view range. And if we, for example, if we have something that we want to see that's up high in a plan view, whether it's a window that's up high on a wall or something that's down low, we need to make sure that our view range allows us to see that thing. Vertically, we're going to be in a position where, or you can think of it as a camera. Our camera's in a position where it can see the whole range that we want to see. And conversely, we can use view range to hide certain things we don't want to see that are outside of that view range. And then to add just a little more complication to that, view range can be used to define what things look like. So for example, if we have something that's above our cut plane, but we do want to see it, we can display that thing as a hidden line. So we can kind of think of that as outside of the view range, but we can still see it. And a good example of that is like an upper cabinet or a shelf up on a wall, something that would typically display as a hidden line. View depth down here is used to define things that we want to be able to see that are outside of the primary range. So you can see that the top, cut, and bottom are the primary range. The view depth are things that are happening below that. So for example, a footing on a foundation, we might want to see that. So we might have to adjust the view depth so that we can see sort of like Superman X-ray vision down into the floor. Whenever you look at view range, it can be confusing and the rules for it are a little bit confusing, but it does have this little guide here. If we click on show, this little guide that pops out is going to define each of these things, and it even gives us a little graphic of what each of those things means. So you can see the primary range is shown in blue, view depth is shown in yellow, and then 7 is sort of like the entire view range. So each one of these settings is going to have a default. Typically the bottom is going to be at the associated level. We're in view 3, remember. We're in floor 3 rather. So floor 3 is the primary range bottom at 0. The cut plane by default is typically going to be 4 feet above that level, and then the top is typically going to be 7.5 feet above that level. Each one of these things, because they're white, can be changed, and if you wanted to, for example, change your view depth, you could actually change the associated level, so it would go all the way down to floor 2 if you wanted it to. You could also give it a negative offset to make it go just a little bit into floor 2, just a little bit below floor 3 rather. And then if you really want to dig into this thing and learn more about view range, because as I mentioned, there are some very strange rules on how it handles objects. Certain objects it handles different from other ones. Click on this learn more about view range. Don't be afraid of clicking on stuff like this and you'll get a full explanation. This just basically opens up the Revit help file and it'll go through and it'll walk you through all of those different rules. And sometimes I have to refer to this when I'm just unable to get view range to display the view that the way that I want it to. This is a really handy way to kind of dig into that and figure out what's going on. All right, let's go ahead and go back to floor 1, talking about just a few more view things. Remember that we talked about invisibility graphic overrides. We could just turn things off to hide them in the view, and that's going to hide all of that category. Well, where do those categories come from? Let's kind of take a look at that. If we click on, for example, this column right here, let's look over in the properties palette and let's see if we can figure out what category that object belongs to. And if you look right under the type selector, it says structural columns 1. Well, structural columns is a category in Visibility Graphic Override, and structural columns happens to be right here. So if I turned that off in here, I could hide all of the columns. They're not going to show up. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. But sometimes we just want to hide one of something, right? We don't want to hide all of them. We just wanted to hide one column, for example, this one right here. So if I right-click on that column, I always get this hide in view option, and I can either select category, which would hide all of them, or just that single element or multiple elements, depending on what I have selected at the time. So if I had just one thing selected and I right-clicked on it and said hide in view element, just that one goes away. Undo. If I select more than one by holding down the Control key and I right-click and I say hide in view elements, just those 4 go away. Okay, so there's multiple ways that we can hide and display objects. Now, typically, and this is key, when you hide something with that method or with Visibility Graphic Override, the intent is to keep it hidden in the view. And when we print the final set, we don't see that thing, right? So usually we're only going to use those hide options when we know we don't want to see them. But on occasion, we want to hide things that we do intend to print ultimately, so we want to temporarily hide them for the purpose of making drafting easier. And when we do that, we typically are going to use the temporary hide isolate tool. So temporarily hide isolate objects is the little pair of glasses down here in the view control bar. All right, so let's do that. If I select this column and I click on temporary hide, I can either hide or isolate the category. If I hide the category, it's going to hide all of them. If I hide the element, it's just going to hide that one, but it's going to do it in a way that doesn't permanently change the view. And if I close this view and then reopen it, well, it's still hidden, right? If I close Revit and reopen it, it will not be hidden anymore. So it's temporary. And to unhide that thing, I simply click on this and say reset temporary hide isolate. And then it just kind of brings everything that you temporarily hid back. So what if you hide a thing using the other method, where I did earlier, where you said hide in view element, and I want to find that thing? How do I unhide that? There's nothing down here that's going to unhide all of the hidden elements, right? So what we have to do in that case is to click on this light bulb to temporarily reveal hidden elements, and anything that's hidden in the view is going to show up magenta. And you can see that there are a number of things that are hidden in there, and for some reason it's showing all of the columns hidden, but they are not all hidden. So let's just remind me which one is hidden. Okay, it's just this one right here. I'm not sure why all of those are showing up magenta. There might be some additional hidden stuff in there. But if I right click on it now and I say unhide in view element, it'll bring it back, and then I can toggle this back off and I've got all of my columns back. It's a little bit confusing, a lot in that segment, but just remember, temporary when you just need to hide something for the purpose of cleaning up the drawing for drafting, and hide, reveal by right clicking, and those are the kind of the more semi-permanent hiding things that we want to do. So we'll talk about that more in the future to remind you, but for now, just understand there are 2 different ways to hide stuff. So earlier when we changed all of the walls in the view to hidden lines, that was using Visibility Graphic Overrides, but on occasion we might want to change what just one of those things looks like, right? So if we just wanted to change this one column and how it looked, and there's not really a good reason why we would want to do that, but it's here in my face, so I'm just using it as an example. You can also right click on this thing and say override graphics in view. So we would use this in a case where we just want to override one or more, but we want to individually select them and not do the whole category necessarily. Now we could do the category also, but typically if we're going to do that, we're just going to use VGO for that. So override graphics in view by element, so it's just the ones that we have selected, and then I can get in there and I can change what just that one looks like. Okay, and all of the same sort of, it's laid out a little bit different than VGO, but basically all of the same overrides are available in here. Okay, we are at the end. One more thing we're going to cover today, and that is the creating and using view templates. And this is very simple. The hardest part about this thing is just remembering where it is, how to access it. You're always going to remember that you have this available, but it's one of those things where there's just not a button, at least not that I'm aware of, and usually I just do this the easiest way, which is right click. Okay, so what is a view template? First of all, if we go through floor one and we hide things and we change the display of things, and we've done a lot of work in here to change what this thing look like. Maybe we've changed the line weight, how thick the lines are in this view, and we spent all that time doing that, and then we go to floor two and we want to do the same thing here. You can see I have an underlay turned on here. Oh, actually, do I have an underlay turned on? I'm not sure why this is displaying gray now. Oh, never mind. This is a Revit link. Okay, let's not go down that rabbit hole right now. The point is, I've done a lot to override the graphics in this view. Okay, so I want to apply that to another floor without having to go back through painstakingly changing all of those individual visibility graphic override values to look the same. I can save that work in a template, in a visibility, you can sort of think of it as a visibility template that looks at all the overrides that I've applied to this view, and it saves them so that I can just reapply them to another view quickly and easily. So the way that we do that is we just right click on the view that we did all that work in, and we say create view template from view. We can give it a name, and we can just call it, like, you know, floor one settings, for example. And then we can go through and choose the different categories individually that we want to apply the change to. So we don't have to apply it to every view setting, but typically we are going to have them all checked. There'll be a check mark next to each one. Now we can go into more depth about, you know, copying existing ones and editing and doing all sorts of crazy stuff to it. But for now, we've done all the work. We've done all the overriding. So we're just saving a template at this point. We're just going to say OK, and now that template is created. So now if I go to floor 2 or 3, I can right click on that floor and I can say apply template properties. So that template that I created will be in that list right there. And if I select that and then click OK, all of those changes, the hidden lines for the walls, all of those changes that I made have now been applied. Anything that I hid in that previous view, that goes away. The line weight changes, patterns, view scale, or view depth, view range, that's all going to be applied to this one as well. So again, it's just right clicking on the one that you've done all the work in to create the view template, and then right clicking on the one you want to apply it to apply template properties. Quick and easy. It's a real time saver if you have to do a lot of overriding. Okay, that was kind of a long video with a whole bunch of information in it, but just a lot to cover in this chapter. Some of them are longer than others. Obviously, this is a longer one. So anyway, do the best you can with remembering all that stuff, and we'll jump into the next chapter coming up, which will be chapter 4, dealing with components, something a little more fun than view settings. We're going to get to do a little bit of building in this chapter. That's it for now. We'll see you next time.